The story opens with a visually jarring and high-stakes scene. A trembling young woman in a plain black delivery uniform bursts through the heavy, soundproof doors of an exclusive private lounge. Her face is a mask of terror, her breath coming in frantic hitches as she ignores the shocked gasps of the city's elite. She bypasses the rows of armed guards and runs straight to a broad-shouldered man with slick back hair and a gold chain, the city's most formidable Korean Mafia boss. Dropping to her knees, she clutches his expensive suit sleeve with white-knuckle desperation, her voice cracking as she delivers a plea that stops the room. They're hurting her. Please, you're the only one who can stop them. Stay with me until the end, because the choice this man makes is something you have to see to believe. It's a moment that redefined the city's underworld forever. Before we dive into the shadows of the Onyx Club, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community. It helps us bring more of these stories to life. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Now, let's go back to that humid, high-stakes evening in the heart of the city's most exclusive district at the Onyx Club, a dimly lit lounge that serves as the undisputed domain of Seo Kang-Jun. At the height of his power, Kang-Jun is an enigmatic leader who has built a criminal empire through surgical precision and absolute emotional detachment. He operates by a singular, lethal philosophy, that sentiment is a liability and control is the only currency that matters. This ice-cold nature was perfected over years of rising through a world where any sign of mercy was an invitation for betrayal, teaching him to keep his heart as unreachable as his private vault. The meticulously controlled environment of his inner circle is shattered when Elena Marrow bursts into the room. While his lieutenants reach for their weapons and wealthy patrons stare in stunned silence, Elena's raw instinct leads her to the one man in the room with the power to alter her fate. She grips Kang-Jun's arm, a touch that would usually mean death for a stranger, and delivers a desperate cry that silences the music. They're hurting her. Looking down into her terrified eyes, the hardened boss feels a flicker of something long forgotten, as the impenetrable walls he built around his soul begin to show their first cracks. Inside the Onyx Club, the air didn't just hang, it hummed with the heavy, pressurized silence of a tomb. At the center of this stillness sat Seo Kang-Jun. He was leaned back in a leather armchair that looked more like a throne, his posture relaxed in a way that only a man with nothing to fear could afford. The dim amber light of the lounge caught the glint of the thick gold chain around his neck, a bold contrast to the sharp, midnight black fabric of his tailored suit. When he moved his hand to adjust a crystal tumbler of whiskey, the cuff of his shirt shifted, revealing the tail of a dragon tattoo creeping up his neck, a permanent mark of the fire he had walked through to claim this city. To the outside world, Kang-Jun was a myth, to the men in this room, he was a god. Around him, the city's elite, corrupt politicians, high-stakes brokers, and seasoned lieutenants, spoke in hushed, reverent tones. No one laughed too loudly. No one made sudden movements. Every person present was acutely aware that a single nod from Kang-Jun could make a man's fortune, while a slight narrowing of his eyes could make a man disappear before dawn. He was a master of surgical precision, a man who viewed the world as a series of equations where emotions were nothing more than rounding errors. His reputation was built on a foundation of ironclad detachment. He didn't just rule the underworld, he curated it, ensuring that every transaction in every territory followed the strict, blood-stained lines he had drawn. His lieutenants stood like shadows against the velvet walls, their hands never far from their holsters, watching the room with the same predatory stillness as their boss. They were the extensions of his will, the enforcers of a peace kept by the constant, unspoken threat of extreme violence. In this domain, time seemed to slow down, governed by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock and the slow swirl of ice in Kang-Jun's glass. He lived in the calm before the storm, a space he had occupied for nearly 2 decades. He believed he had reached a state of perfect isolation, a king who needed no one and felt nothing. But as the ice clinked against the glass, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall began to groan under the weight of an unexpected force, signaling that the fortress he had built around his life was about to be breached by the one thing he couldn't calculate, raw, human desperation. The heavy, double-mirrored doors of the Onyx Club didn't just open, they were slammed back with a violence that sent a shockwave through the room. The rhythmic clink of crystal and the low hum of conspiratorial whispers died instantly. Standing in the threshold was a young black woman, her chest heaving as she gasped for air that seemed too thin for her lungs. Elena Marrow looked like a jagged tear in the fabric of this polished, expensive world. She wore a plain black delivery uniform, scuffed at the knees and dusted with the grime of the city streets, a stark, humble contrast to the silk and velvet surrounding her. The reaction was immediate. 4 of Kang-Jun's personal guards moved with the synchronized lethality of a strike team, their suit jackets flaring as they drew their weapons. The metallic clicks of safeties being disengaged echoed like small thunderclaps in the hollow silence. Red laser sights danced across Elena's chest, centering on her heart, but she didn't so much as blink. To her, the men with guns were merely obstacles in a room full of shadows. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with a terrifying clarity, were locked onto the man in the leather armchair. She began to move. It was a desperate, stumbling run that ignored the shouts of the guards and the cold muzzles of the pistols tracking her every step. She surged past a senator and a diamond merchant, her gaze never wavering from Kang-Jun's unreadable face. Just as the lead enforcer stepped forward to intercept her with a heavy hand, she dropped. Elena hit the floor, her knees striking the polished wood with a sickening thud, and slid forward until she reached Kang-Jun's feet. In an act that made the entire room hold its collective breath, she reached out. Her trembling, calloused hands that spent their days carrying packages for minimum wage, clutched the sleeve of Kang-Jun's bespoke Italian blazer. The guards froze, waiting for the signal to end her life for the sacrilege of touching the boss. But the signal didn't come. Kang-Jun remained perfectly still, his whiskey glass paused halfway to his lips. He looked down at the small, shaking hands gripping his arm like a drowning person clutching a driftwood plank. He saw the raw bravery of a woman who had run past death itself because she had nowhere else to turn. In that moment, the power dynamic of the Onyx Club shifted. The most dangerous man in the city sat silent, allowing a powerless stranger to anchor herself to him, her desperation finally piercing the quiet danger of his domain. The silence that followed was more deafening than the drawing of the weapons. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room as every lieutenant and high-ranking soldier stared in paralyzed disbelief. In the hierarchy of Seo Kang-Jun's world, his person was sacred, his space inviolable. To touch him without permission was a death sentence, to grab him in a moment of frantic desperation was unthinkable. The lead guard, a man named Daeho whose knuckles were scarred from years of enforcing Kang-Jun's silence, stepped forward, his hand tightening around the grip of his firearm. He waited for the slight tilt of the chin or the cold flicker of an eye that would signal him to peel this girl away and dispose of the intrusion. But Kang-Jun didn't move. He sat like a statue carved from obsidian, his gaze fixed on the small, trembling hands that were wrinkling the sleeve of his $100,000 suit. He could feel the heat radiating from her palms and the rhythmic shaking of her entire body. Slowly, with a deliberate grace that made the guards hold their breath, he set his whiskey glass down on the marble-topped table. The soft clink was the only sound in the lounge. He leaned forward, bringing his face inches from Elena's. His expression remained a mask of stone, but his dark eyes began a slow, surgical scan of her face. He saw the salt trails of dried tears, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, and the raw, unadulterated terror in her pupils. But beneath the fear, he saw something else, a fierce, flickering spark of defiance. She was terrified of him, yes, but she was more terrified of failing the person she was trying to save. In that gaze, Kang-Jun felt a sudden, sharp phantom of his own past. He saw the ghost of a younger version of himself, a boy with nothing but his pride and a desperate need to protect what was his, standing before men who could have crushed him like an insect. He recognized that specific brand of bravery. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk directly into the jaws of a monster because the alternative was worse. A subtle wave of his hand dismissed the guards. The red laser dots vanished from Elena's chest as the men retreated into the shadows, their confusion masked by professional discipline. Kang-Jun didn't pull his arm away. Instead, he allowed the contact to remain, acknowledging the unspoken code of the desperate. For the first time in 30 years, the most dangerous man in the city didn't see a nuisance or a victim, he saw a mirror. "Who is hurting her?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried the weight of a final judgment. "And why did you think a man like me would care?" Elena's voice was a jagged whisper, barely audible over the hum of the lounge's ventilation, yet it carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone within earshot. She didn't let go of his sleeve. If anything, her grip tightened, her knuckles white as she spilled the truth. She spoke of a reckless crew, a group of men who called themselves the Vipers, who had snatched her best friend from the loading dock of the warehouse where they worked. They weren't asking for a ransom she could ever pay, they were hurting her just because they could, using terror as a calling card to establish a name for themselves in the district. As Elena described the men, their jagged tattoos, their crude laughter, and the way they boasted about owning the streets now, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kang-Jun's expression didn't change, but his eyes turned into chips of obsidian. He knew of the Vipers. They were a disorganized, violent faction of bottom feeders who mistook cruelty for power. But more importantly, he knew they were operating in the East End, his East End. For Kang-Jun, this was no longer just a plea for help, it was a notification of a breach. In his world, there were lines that kept the chaos of the city at bay. You didn't target the innocent, you didn't cause unnecessary noise, and you certainly didn't operate a kidnapping ring in the heart of his territory without paying tribute or seeking permission. These men were not just hurting a girl, they were insulting his sovereignty. They were a virus in his meticulously curated system, thinking they could thrive in the shadows he provided while violating the very rules that kept those shadows stable. He looked at Elena, seeing the way her lower lip trembled as she finished her story. She was waiting for him to laugh, to push her away, or to demand a price she couldn't afford. Instead, Kang-Jun stood up. The movement was slow and fluid, possessed of a terrifying elegance that sent his chair rolling back silently on the carpet. He reached down and, for the first time, placed his hand over hers. It was a brief, heavy contact, not a gesture of comfort, but a seal of a contract. "The East End belongs to me," he said, his voice echoing with the finality of a death warrant. "And these men have forgotten whose air they are breathing." He turned toward Dae-ho, who was already signaling for the rest of the security detail to mobilize. The ice-cold boss was no longer just a spectator in the lounge. The machine of his empire was humming to life, and the reckless crew who thought they were kings of the street were about to realize they had invited a dragon into their den. Seo Kang-Jun stood with a slow, predatory grace that seemed to draw the very light out of the room. As he straightened his blazer, the gold chain at his neck caught the amber glow of the lounge, flickering like a warning. He did not reach for a telephone to alert the authorities. In his world, the police were merely spectators to a justice they weren't equipped to handle. Instead, he looked toward the shadows where his most trusted enforcers waited. With a single, sharp nod, the room transformed from a place of leisure into a war room. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of preparation. Dae-ho stepped forward, his face a mask of grim anticipation as he began barking low-frequency orders into a radio. Within moments, the lounge was cleared of its wealthy bystanders, leaving only the men who lived and breathed by Kang-Jun's code. These were not mere street thugs, they were a disciplined extension of Kang-Jun's will, men who moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. They checked the slides of their weapons and adjusted their tactical gear with the practiced ease of soldiers preparing for a crusade. Kang-Jun walked to a heavy mahogany desk at the back of the lounge and pulled a leather-bound map from a hidden drawer. He didn't need to study it long, he knew every alleyway and dead-end street in the East End as if they were the lines on his own palm. He pointed to a derelict shipyard, a place the Vipers had mistakenly thought was beneath his notice. "They think the darkness is their ally," Kang-Jun said, his voice a cold, resonant rasp. "They think they can stain my city with their lack of honor and hide in the rot." He looked at his men, his eyes burning with a dark, focused intensity. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a demonstration. He was going to show the city, and anyone else foolish enough to watch, what happened when the lines were crossed. He was going to remind the underworld that his silence was not a sign of absence, but a sign of absolute control. "We don't just bring the girl back," Kang-Jun commanded, his hand resting briefly on the hilt of a concealed blade. "We dismantle the very idea that they ever existed." Turning back to Elena, who stood trembling amidst the sudden whirlwind of activity, he saw her fear battling with a newfound hope. He didn't offer her empty platitudes or comfort. He simply offered the truth of his power. "Stay close," he told her, the words carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. As the heavy doors of the Onyx Club opened once more, they didn't reveal the quiet street, but a fleet of black sedans waiting like a funeral procession for the men who had dared to disrespect his domain. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a predatory shark cutting through dark water. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon of leather and hushed engine noise, a stark contrast to the neon chaos blurring past the tinted windows. Elena sat perched on the edge of the plush seat, her hands still interlaced tightly in her lap, her eyes wide as she watched the city transform. They were moving through the underbelly now, past the flickering signs of dive bars and the shadowed corners where the law rarely ventured. The glowing red and blue lights of the nightlife smeared against the glass, casting a rhythmic, bloody hue over Kang-Jun's stoic profile. Kang-Jun sat beside her, his presence filling the confined space with a mountain of quiet gravity. He wasn't looking at the streets, he was looking forward, his mind clearly moving 3 steps ahead of the vehicles trailing them. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was heavy with the realization that they were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Elena stole a glance at him, noticing how the passing streetlights illuminated the gold chain at his throat and the sharp, unforgiving line of his jaw. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, cold, inevitable, and terrifyingly calm. "We're getting close, aren't we?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she recognized a familiar skeletal crane on the horizon. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted metal and forgotten industry, the perfect place for men who wanted to disappear. Kang-Jun turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the predatory edge softened into something steadier, a gaze that didn't just see her fear, but anchored it. "Do not let your heart fail you now," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards of the car. "I have seen many things in this city, Elena. I have seen men break and empires fall. But I have never seen a debt go unpaid in my domain." He leaned slightly closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain clinging to his coat. "You came to me because you believed I had the power to change this. You were right. Know this, I never make a promise I cannot keep. By the time the sun rises, those men will regret the day they learned your friend's name." Elena felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. It was the realization that the man beside her wasn't just going to save her friend, he was going to rewrite the balance of the city. As the car turned onto a gravel path leading toward the dark silhouette of the docks, the neon lights faded behind them, swallowed by a darkness that Kang-Jun was about to claim as his own. The shipyard warehouse loomed like a rusted ribcage against the charcoal sky. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of salt, oil, and the frantic, shallow breathing of the terrified. The Vipers, a dozen men fueled by cheap adrenaline and a false sense of security, were gathered around a makeshift table, their laughter echoing off the corrugated metal walls. They were so busy reveling in their own perceived cruelty that they didn't hear the silence fall outside. They didn't notice the shadows detaching themselves from the darkness. Then, the heavy steel door didn't burst open, it groaned as it was pushed aside with a steady, deliberate force. Seo Kang-Jun stepped into the pool of harsh yellow light. He walked alone, his hands empty and his silk overcoat draped perfectly over his shoulders. Behind him, the night was a wall of black, but the men inside could feel the presence of 100 invisible eyes. The Vipers scrambled for their weapons, their movements clumsy and panicked, but as Kang-Jun continued to walk toward them, a strange, suffocating paralysis took hold of the room. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a gun. He simply kept walking, the rhythmic tap of his leather shoes on the concrete floor sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. One by one, the rival thugs froze. They recognized the gold chain. They recognized the dragon etched into his neck. More than that, they recognized the sheer, absolute certainty of the man standing before them. It was the presence of a true apex predator entering a den of scavengers. "I am told," Kang-Jun said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that seemed to vibrate the very metal of the warehouse, "that some of you believe this city has grown soft. That you believe you can take what is mine and face no reckoning." The leader of the Vipers, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, felt his hand tremble so violently he nearly dropped his pistol. He looked into Kang-Jun's eyes that were as cold and empty as the deep ocean, and realized that pulling the trigger wouldn't save him. It would only make his end more painful. Kang-Jun stopped 10 feet away, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor until it touched the feet of his enemies. He looked at the girl tied to a chair in the corner, Elena's friend, and then back at the men who had touched her. The silence was absolute. Not a single shot had been fired, yet the battle was already over. The Vipers stood like statues, broken by the mere weight of a reputation they had been foolish enough to challenge. They had expected a fight, they hadn't realized they were already standing in their own graveyard. The heavy silence of the warehouse was punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic tapping of Kang-Jun's shoes as he stepped closer to the leader of the Vipers. The man with the scarred nose tried to lift his weapon, but his arm felt like lead, weighed down by the sheer, suffocating gravity of Kang-Jun's presence. With a movement so fast it was almost invisible, Kang-Jun reached out and gripped the man's wrist. There was a sickening snap of bone, and the pistol clattered to the concrete floor. Before the leader could even scream, Kang-Jun's other hand forced him downward. It wasn't just physical strength, it was the weight of a decade of absolute rule pressing into the man's shoulders. The rival leader hit the floor, his knees cracking against the stone, forced into the same position Elena had taken in the lounge, but where Elena's posture had been a testament to courage, his was a portrait of cowardice. Kang-Jun knelt down, his face inches from the man who had thought himself a king of the docks. He reached out and caught a single tear of terror tracking through the grime on the man's cheek with the tip of his finger. He looked at it with clinical detachment, as if studying a flawed specimen. "You think power is found in the tears of the helpless," Kang-Jun said, his voice a low, lethal silk that chilled the air. "You think that because no one stood up to you, you were strong. But true power isn't the ability to terrorize a girl in a warehouse. True power is the restraint to keep the world in balance." He leaned closer, the gold chain at his neck swinging like a pendulum. "Terrorizing the powerless isn't a sign of strength, little man. It is the ultimate confession of weakness. It is the act of a scavenger who is too afraid to face a real wolf." The rival leader tried to stammer an apology, but the words died in his throat as Kang-Jun's gaze drifted to the corner of the room. He saw the bruises on the kidnapped girl's face, and for the first time, a flash of genuine, white-hot fury flickered behind his obsidian eyes. "In my city, we have lines," Kang-Jun whispered. "You didn't just cross them. You acted as if they didn't exist. Now, you will learn the price of a tear shed in my domain." He stood up, looking down at the broken man as if he were nothing more than a stain on his shoes. He didn't need to finish the job himself. He simply turned his back, signaling to the shadows where Daeho and the others waited. As Kang-Jun walked toward the tied-up girl to personally cut her bonds, the warehouse echoed not with a fight, but with the sound of a man finally realizing that he had invited a nightmare into his home. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the pristine glass windows of a small, thriving logistics storefront in the heart of the city. Elena Marrow moved with a new sense of grace, her shoulders squared and her gaze steady as she managed a team of couriers. She was no longer the invisible girl in the scuffed work outfit, hiding from the shadows of the street. Now, she was a woman who walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood in the world. Outside, a black sedan sat idling at the curb, not as a threat, but as a silent sentinel. The neighborhood knew that Elena and her business were under an exclusive, ironclad protection, and the predators who once stalked these alleys had long since moved on to easier targets. Seo Kang-Jun watched her from the back seat of the car, his expression as unreadable as ever, yet subtly softened. In his hand, he held a small, hand-drawn thank you card he had received weeks ago, its edges slightly worn from where his thumb had traced the lines. He still wore the gold chain, and the dragon tattoo still peeked from his collar, but the ice-cold aura that had defined his life for 20 years had transformed into something deeper and more profound. He had realized that absolute control was a hollow victory if it wasn't used to safeguard the things that actually mattered. The city still feared his name, perhaps more than ever, but the nature of that fear had shifted. His lieutenants noticed the change in the way he conducted business, with a renewed sense of honor and a refusal to tolerate the exploitation of the weak. By choosing to answer Elena's desperate plea that night in the Onyx Club, Kang-Jun hadn't just saved a life, he had excavated his own soul from the wreckage of his past. Elena looked up and caught his eye through the window, offering a small, knowing smile. Kang-Jun gave a single, respectful nod before the sedan pulled away into the flow of the city. He was still a king in a world of shadows, but he was no longer a king of a cold, empty castle. He had found a purpose that went beyond power, discovering that the greatest strength didn't come from the fear he inspired, but from the lives he chose to protect. The legend of the girl who knelt before a king had become the foundation of a new order, proving that even in the darkest corners of the underworld, humanity could still find a way to bloom. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true leadership isn't about how many people you control, but how many people you protect. In a world that often ignores the delivery girls and the little people, Seo Kang-Jun chose to listen. He reminded us that those with the most power have the greatest responsibility to those with the least. But I want to know what you think. If you were in Kang-Jun's shoes, would you have protected someone who had nothing to offer you, or would you have stayed in your own world? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'll be down there replying to as many of you as I can. Since we are a brand new channel, every like and subscribe helps us more than you know. If you want to see more stories where the underdog wins and justice is served, join our community by hitting that subscribe button. Share this with one friend who believes in doing the right thing, and I'll see you in the next unimaginable story.